Well, hello and good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on where you're located today. And welcome to the Salesforce Marketing Cloud Developer Group virtual meeting on AMP for Email Deep Dive. My name is Elliot Harper, and I've spent the past few months participating on the AMP for Email pilot Salesforce Marketing Cloud. During this time, and a few hundred hours later, I've learned the framework and built a number of AMP emails for Marketing Cloud. Now, I just want to start by checking that you're all here for the correct webinar. This isn't a presentation on AMP-Script. Despite their naming convention, AMP-Script and AMP for Email are completely unrelated. Additionally, you'd have noted that when you registered for the webinar, that this session is geared for developers, specifically developers with experience in JavaScript. Of course, everyone is welcome. But JavaScript knowledge is really a prerequisite if you want to follow my presentation and leverage all the capabilities of the framework. We have a lot of ground to cover, and hopefully there'll be an opportunity for you to go and ask questions at the end. But I won't be pausing to accept questions during my presentation. Instead, you can post your questions to a Q&A panel, which you'll find in chat in the Bevy virtual application. Well, let's begin. In our session today, I'll start by briefly explaining what AMP for Email is, what it does, and how it works. Then I'll share some actual AMP emails that I've built, before moving on to guiding you through the steps to create sophisticated AMP emails in Salesforce Marketing Cloud, so you can quickly get started. This is a fast-paced session, and we have a lot of ground to cover. So I want to leave time for questions, but if you're looking to learn more about AMP for Email fundamentals and different use cases, then I encourage you to watch my hour-long presentation that I delivered last week, which is available at youtube.com/cloudkettle. And there'll be a link to that resource at the end of my presentation. But firstly, what is AMP? Well, AMP is an open source HTML framework that was initially created by Google and is now maintained by the AMP open source project. The original objective of the framework was to enable web pages to load fast on mobile devices. AMP was originally an acronym for Accelerated Mobile Pages. However, since its inception in 2015, the framework has diversified from optimizing the mobile web browsing experience into addressing other applications through subdividing the framework to include AMP websites to enable websites to load quickly, AMP stories for delivering news and information in a mobile-focused format, AMP ads for delivering online advertisements quickly, and AMP email, or AMP for Email, for adding dynamic content and interactivity to email messages. In this session, we'll be focusing on AMP for Email, which uses a subset of components from the core AMP framework that addresses the paradigms of traditional email development, while also enabling rapid development of highly dynamic and interactive email content. Now, Salesforce Marketing Cloud has recently joined the list of over 30 email service providers and platforms that support AMP for Email. The benefits of AMP emails can be broadly categorized into the following functional areas. As I mentioned at the start of my presentation, you can watch my other video to learn more about each of these capabilities in detail. However, in summary, dynamic content refers to the ability to download content dynamically at the time of email open. Specifically, it fetches JSON content when the email is opened. In turn, AMP emails can retrieve and display both text and image content in real time, ensuring the content is always up to date, which can result in a highly relevant user experience. Interactive Forms is similar to the interactive email feature in Marketing Cloud, in that it provides the ability to fill in fields and submit forms from within an email. However, AMP support takes this capability to a completely different level, as it provides a number of options for form validation. AMP emails can either pass the response data returned from the server-side script on form submission and display a custom message within the email, or there are comprehensive field validation options for displaying validation messages when the user attempts to submit the form, or even as they type values in the fields. Additionally, support for asynchronous validation of form fields is also supported, where field values can be sent to a remote server as the recipient completes the form, which is useful for validating whether a username is taken. In fact, I'll show you an example of this type of validation in action during my demonstration today. Extended CSS support refers to support for over 220 CSS properties, including common pseudo classes for state-based styling of elements, and also transition and transform properties. So you can animate elements on the page based on user action. And I'll show you just one example of this in my demonstration today. And finally, dynamic styling refers to the ability to allow HTML element classes to be set dynamically based on a user action. For example, when a link or button is clicked, or perhaps data is input in a field. Again, I'll be providing some examples of this in my demonstration, and I'll be walking you through how to achieve this in the tutorial today. Let me now explain how email clients are able to display AMP emails. The vast majority of emails sent today use the multi-purpose Internet Mail Extensions, or MIME standard, which, among other purposes, provide support for multiple parts for transferring both HTML and plain text formats in a single email. AMP for email includes an additional AMP HTML MIME part within the multi-part alternative MIME tree, as we see on the right-hand side here. Now, the way this works is that, generally speaking, email clients display the last part within the tree that they can understand. Email clients that support AMP emails will display the AMP content part first, and for those who don't, will fall back to the HTML version and then the plain text version. AMP emails are supported by Gmail, Yahoo Mail, and Mail.ru for Russian subscribers. Sending to both service provider domains and custom domains are supported. For example, recipients don't have to have a gmail.com address. Additionally, AMP emails can only be displayed on supported user agents, which, in addition to mobile apps, include Chrome, Firefox, Safari, and Opera web browsers. I'd now like to share a few examples that I've created which highlight the capabilities of this framework. So for this demonstration, I'm actually going to be using the AMP Gmail Playground, which is one of several development environments that we'll be using today to test and preview emails. The first is a lottery number selector. Now, this is part of an email for a lottery client. Now, while I can't share the details of the actual campaign, I can show you the main functionality. The client wanted to create a lottery ticket selector where customers can pick their winning numbers right from within the email. Additionally, the number of available numbers can change based on which game the subscriber is playing. Here you can see I've actually gone and built a mini app within my email. Let me just go and zoom out so you can all see that entire interface. So I can, when the email loads, all these numbers we see here are retrieved at open time based on the selected game. And I can now choose my numbers within the email. So let me go ahead and do that, like 12, 13. And as you can see, as I'm doing that, they're added to the top row. I can also change my mind. I didn't want 12, I actually wanted 14 instead. And they're pruned from the top when I deselect them. And once I've selected 7, and only once I've selected 7, can I then submit the form down the bottom. And I'm redirected to a secure link via checkout page to complete my purchase. Now, optionally as well, I can load random numbers. I click here, which uses an API to go and retrieve numbers at random, and also, of course, change them. 13 is unlucky for me, so I'll change it to 12. Now, in this next example, I've recreated a popular hangman game. When the email is opened, a random word is retrieved from a remote server. So let me just emulate this just by changing my code here to force that email to reload. And you can see that it can have a even longer word here. I can now attempt to guess the letters in the word. So let me go for the obvious ones: A, E, I, O, U, And as you can see, as I make incorrect choices, it's showing how many lies I have left up the top. So J, okay, S, no, T, no, how about V, no, C, R, how about, it must be jaundice. I don't know that, by the way. Jaundice, it is jaundice. That's quite fun. So let's show you a couple of other campaigns. So firstly, there's this one here, and you might have seen this from my LinkedIn post. So this is actually a recent campaign that was sent a couple of weeks ago. And I've built this email to allow recipients to preview various lipstick shades within the email. So let's go and do that. I can go and butterscotch. Notice that the color changes. I can also choose to add items to my bag. So let's go and say I want that praline, and it's added down here. And I can also go and increase the quantity. So let me go and increase this to 2, for example. And I'll just go and select another product. So on teas and click add to bag there. You can see this is added too. Unless I want 2 of these, and in fact, I only want 1 of those. I've changed my mind. So now when I go and click on the checkout link down the bottom, I'm redirected straight to the e-commerce checkout page in Commerce Cloud. So I can complete my purchase, and you can see this has been populated with those products I selected. Now, in this next example, I've built an interactive form and completely customized the look and feel of the form using extended styling capabilities. And you can see this is actually in a mobile view. I actually want to see what this email is going to look like when it's sent to the subscriber. So let me, from the playground, I can send it right to my Gmail address, and I'll just open up my email, which is, here it is. I'll just go and refresh this. And here it is, it's just come in. So I can now go and complete my reviews. Let's say it's, I love it, I'd recommend the product. And you'll observe that as I go and change these options here, the text label changes on the left-hand side to indicate my selection. So comfortable and pretty great, I'd say. I've also built in asynchronous field validation. So in this instance, when a user completes a nickname field, maybe Simon 99, and I'll just go and kind of click away, then I'm using a real-time API to validate if the nickname is taken, and which it is here. So let me go and change this to 33. I don't know whether that's taken, is it? We'll find out in a second. It's available, fantastic. And we've also got a number of different field validation options here. So here, like I say, this is great, and submit my review, you can see that it's prompting me to write at least 50 characters in this field. So we'll go and do that, and I'll just fantastic value, and I'll add my review. I'm going to be a bit lazy today and just go and copy some text here. Back to my email. No, not that one, in my inbox. And submit my review. When I submit the form, I'm displaying a confirmation message directly in the email without redirecting the user to away to a different web page, and also hiding other elements on the page. Let's now move on to the deep dive section of today's session. I'd like to start by explaining the framework and architecture before walking you through each of the other topics in a guided tutorial format. The AMP framework follows a model view model, or MVVM architectural pattern that facilitates the separation of the view, that is the HTML, from the view model, which is the logic, and the model, which is data used by your email. Now, the focus of this architectural pattern in the AMP emails will vary by application, For example, an AMP email might only contain HTML, that is a view to display static HTML content. However, for event-driven applications that are initiated by a user action, for example, updating data when clicking on a button, then this pattern applies. Let me discuss this view in more detail. So AMP uses HTML for presenting or rendering content in a user agent. For example, a supported web-based email client in the context of AMP emails. HTML email elements can include properties to enable dynamic binding of values. For example, setting a CSS class or text to appear within the element. Additionally, event handlers can be installed on elements to perform actions. Next, the view model in AMP emails use expressions, which follow a JavaScript-like syntax and are used to bind data values to HTML element properties, where the element's property is bound to or updated with the result of the expression. Expressions can also invoke actions on components, for example, submitting a form when a button is clicked. And finally, the model uses a JSON object or objects for the data model, referred to as a state. In AMP emails, a state is a mutable data storage model where data can be updated based on a user action during the active session, for example, while the email is open. With this architecture in mind, let's now build out a sophisticated AMP email. In this tutorial, I'll introduce you to several frequently used components and framework concepts. I'll also provide a link to all my code used in this tutorial at the end of my presentation, so you can use it to quickly get started in building your own AMP emails. In this scenario, we'll send an email to travel customers that features destinations they might be interested in. Additionally, we want to give customers an option to add a destination to their wish list, so when they log onto the website, they'll see the locations that they've added to their wish list from the email. We're going to use a number of AMP framework components to personalize our email, specifically AMP list, to retrieve a JSON array of recommended destinations that the traveler might be interested in, AMP form, to submit a form each time they add an item to their wish list, AMP mustache, to display the retrieved JSON data from the AMP list component, AMP bind, to enable property binding of text and styles in the email as users interact with it, and AMP image, which is a replacement for the HTML image tag that delays or prioritizes loading of image resources based on the viewport position, system resources, connection bandwidth, and other factors. We're going to start by opening the AMP playground. Now, this is one of a few development environments that we're using today to preview and test our email. And we'll start off by loading the boilerplate HTML that we'll use to build on. So you can simply go to playground.amp.dev and select AMP for email. Here you go. Let's start by looking at what the final AMP email will look like. I'll just go and grab my code here and paste it in here. Now this is fully mobile responsive, so just change to the responsive layout. Just resize this here, and I can change back to iPhone. Now this email includes a number of tiles, and each tile includes a link to add the destination to the wish list, as we see here. When they click on the link, an asynchronous XHR request is made to a remote server, which in this case is a Cloud Page Code resource, which can be used to proxy an API request to an external server, like a CRM or CMS. And a status message is then returned, indicating that an action is currently being performed, and the link will be disabled. So if I just click on this one, for example, you can see updating your wish list, and while that action is happening, I can't click on that button. So once a wish list item has been saved successfully, and a successful response message is returned from the remote server, then the text is updated again with different text, and the link is once again active. And I've also appended a heart icon to the heading, indicating that the destination is on the wish list, just for easy identification. So I can choose to maybe remove this from my wish list. I've changed my mind. Okay, so let's now strip this right back and build out this email step by step. I'm firstly going to grab some boilerplate HTML here, containing the raw HTML and CSS, and I'm just going to move this over. Let's change it to iPhone here. So here we can see our responsive tile, which will be repeated for each destination that we retrieve. Now, we firstly need to use the AMP image component, which is one of 16 components from the AMP framework supported by AMP for email. And as I explained previously, this component is a replacement for the HTML image tag to delay or prioritize loading of image resources based on a number of different factors. So I'm simply going to go and go into this existing tag here and change the tag name from image to AMP-image. And it needs a closing image tag, so I'm going to leave that, and it should auto-complete here. There it is. Fantastic. And you can see now I'm not getting any validation areas. This is valid. Now let's take a look at the server-side code that we will use to retrieve a list of destinations for this subscriber. I've created the following server-side JavaScript code resource page, which provides a convenient way of publishing a publicly accessible endpoint. And the page is in 3 parts. The first part checks and sets cause headers for the XHR or XML HTTP request. So let me explain kind of what's going on here. As a security measure, AMP for email restricts XHR requests to define origins using CORS, or cross-origin resource sharing. There are currently 2 versions of this CORS header implementation, as we see in this illustration here. It's recommended that both versions are implemented in server-side code, as the latest version, which is version 2 on the left-hand side, is not yet fully supported. For example, both the AMP Playground and Gmail AMP Playground environments use version 1 headers. The second part of my server-side code is interpreted when a post request is made to add or remove a destination from the subscriber's wish list, which I'll discuss later. Now, the third part is interpreted when a GET request is made to retrieve content. We'll be using the AMP list component for this, which requires an array with the key items, as we see here. I simply hard-coded this array and the objects within the array for demonstration purposes. But obviously, this would be programmatically built and defined based on recommended destinations for the subscriber. When the code resource is requested, the page returns a stringified array. So down here, I'm simply just writing it out, just back to the email. Technically, it doesn't actually return it to the email. It's to the email service, which is proxied back to the email. Let's now add the required code to our page to retrieve this array. Firstly, we'll need to initialize the components that we'll be using, which is AMP-list and AMP-mustache. And I'll just go and paste this code in our head section of our email. There you go, AMP-mustache and AMP-list. Now we've done that, we can wrap our div to be repeated with the AMP-list and AMP-mustache component. I'll find, here's the opening tile, so I'll just paste my opening elements here, and I'll close them off down the bottom. When the email is rendered, the containing div is repeated for the number of items in the array. I've also included additional divs, which are useful for displaying while the content is being retrieved, and a fallback version to display if the request is unsuccessful, maybe kind of the server is unavailable. So here you can see that it will display loading. If I just go and click refresh, loading appears at the top there. You might want to style that and center it. This is some fallback HTML content we can put in there. I've also, so yeah, let's now go and add some mustache tags to the existing placeholder content. So here's our tile, and we'll go back to the bottom of our tile here. It's like a cooking show. Here's one I created earlier. Now, each of these tags correspond to an object key from the array. Let me show you. For example, we've got title, an image, and content, and URL. And if I go back to the code, you'll see that these correspond to these object keys here. When the array is loaded, the tags are replaced with the key values from the corresponding object. Now that we're retrieving content at open time, let's go and build in functionality to make an asynchronous request when the recipient adds an item to their wish list. Now, to post data to a remote server from the email, you need to create a form. And I'll just go and add an HTML form to the bottom of my email. I'll be discussing the form and the input attribute shortly. So in this scenario, we don't want to display an HTML form on our page. So I've included hidden fields containing the values that we want to include in our post request. And we'll dynamically populate these fields and submit the form when the recipient clicks on a button. So I'm just going to go and update that button code. Where is it? And here it is, button. Now, before we can use this button to submit a form and bind data, I need to load 2 additional AMP libraries in my email. Now, if we go up the top, you'll notice that just by adding the AMP form, it's the Playground automatically detected that and has already gone and loaded the required library. So all I need to do now is to add AMP bind. So I'm just going to paste that in there. Great. So let me explain AMP bind. The AMP bind component is used to add stateful interactivity on AMP pages. There are 3 main concepts of AMP bind. So firstly, state, which is a mutable JSON state where variables are updated in response to user actions. Then we have expressions, which are JavaScript-like expressions that can reference the state. And finally, bindings, which are special attributes that link an element's property to a state via an expression. Let's now take a look at this code I pasted and explain what it does. So firstly, you can see the on this on attribute. So tap is a user action. When the recipient clicks on a button, or taps on it on their mobile device, it will trigger the tap event and invoke the AMP set state method. This binds the action to state variables. Now, think of state variables as perhaps temporary storage, which exists while the email is open. Here, I'm setting 2 state variables. The first binds the ID value from the JSON object. So I've got my mustache tag there to go and retrieve that ID value. And then if I open the state panel, which appears if you're using the AMP bind component, I can see when I go and click on this link that it reveals what those state variables are set to. So you can see this is the current one is aeronang, and the action is add at this one here as well. The second action variable is set using a JavaScript expression, which is here. AMP expressions use the JavaScript ternary operator to conditionally set a value. That is, you can't use if or else statements, but you can use nested ternary operators. Here, you can see that I'm conditionally setting the action key value as a string based on the value of another state variable. So if the in that saved object, if the status of the ID is added, then it's going to set it as remove, otherwise it's add. So if I click on here, you can see this is add. If I now go to one that's been, let me go and click add to my wish list. Oh, it's not, what's happening here? Just 1 second. State variables. Oh yes, that's right. So it's gone and changed to remove. You can see that's all working there. I'm also setting a third variable in a saved object, which we're going to be using shortly. You can see down the bottom to bind a button text property. And finally, the wishlist.submit string we see here submits our form, as our form has this ID of wishlist. So in our hidden input form fields, I'm setting a wishlist ID parameter based on the ID of the state variable in the form object. So here we go. And the second field is set based on the value of the action state variable down here. Now, this square bracket notation uses bindings to link the element's property to the variable. And if I go and inspect the form, so let's go and have a look at our code here. We'll just go and find that that form, which appears down the bottom there. There's our form here. I'll expand this out here. You can see that as I go and change these values, I'll add this to my wish list. You can see that the values are changing in my hidden input field. Do you see that? There we go. It kind of flashes up for you. We can also bind expressions and state variables to other attributes. So let's go and add 2 property bindings on our button element. I'll just kind of collapse this here. And I'll go and add some new lines here. I'm binding the text property to update the text based on the value of a state variable. And I'm actually just getting an error here. I just made a mistake in copying and pasting. So let me go and rectify that. There we go. That's a bit better. So as I said before, I'm just I'm using the text property to update the text based on the value of a state variable. So while you can only use the ternary operator for logical expression evaluation, you can include nested operators, as I mentioned before, which I'm doing here to display one of 3 strings, as we want to indicate to the user when the wish list is being updated and when it's updated successfully. So additionally, I have a similar expression for the disabled property here. To conditionally disable the button while the form is being submitted, and also, if the form submission failed. So you can see that this will evaluate to true if the status is equal to adding. So we click on state here and click on this here. You can see the status is adding, and it doesn't actually automatically refresh. When we open this up again, it's added. So because that state variable changed, the disabled property binding was updated too. So yes, if it's adding or if it failed, then this evaluates to true, and the disabled attribute will be included in the button element. Now we go and take a look at the server-side code. There's not too much to see here. Again, this is just kind of an example just to go and get you started. You can see I'm taking the form fields, that is wishlist ID and action, and simply returning them back in a JSON payload. So I'm just going and creating this object and setting those keys based on those SJS variables, and then just stringifying it back and as a response for my post request. Now, obviously you would add additional code here to perform other operations, like you might want to upsert data extensions or maybe make an API request to an external platform. Now, finally, let's go and add another text property binding to conditionally append a heart icon to the destination when the destination is added to our wish list. So I'll go and find that H1 or H2 element, there it is. And I'm just going to go and insert a span here. I'll just insert some new line just to make it look pretty. And so you can see that if I'll just click add to my wish list, and we can see what's going on here. So it's saying that in the context, of this AMP list object, if the status, in this case, the ID is AONang and the status is added, then it's going to display this HTML character code here. Otherwise, it's not going to display anything. So when I remove it, it disappears. I click add, and once it's successful, it adds there. So how do you use AMP emails in Salesforce Marketing Cloud? Well, it's actually quite straightforward. So you typically build your email in a text editor and test it in a playground or even a web browser. You can actually use Chrome to go and preview AMP emails. But obviously using a playground gives you additional functionality like viewing state variables. So once your email functions correctly, you can copy the code. So let's go and copy this. And let's open up Marketing Cloud. I'm just going to go and create now a new email message. And when I do so, you'll notice that there are two new options added to this create email dropdown. We can choose to create a template in AMP or HTML in AMP. In this case, let's create a template-based email with an AMP version as well. I'll go and select an existing template and give this a name, AMP list demo 2, and save it in a sensible place. And click next. And we simply go and paste our code in here. Let's ignore that link. I'll give it a subject line. Now, when I go and preview the email, I'm going to get some errors because I haven't added some required personalization strings, but that's okay. We can kind of safely ignore this. And we can see that we can now preview what this email will look like when it's sent to the subscriber, and also kind of interact with it as well. So from here, we can now send our email using the send flow in Content Builder, or obviously we could do the same from Journey Builder. And AMP emails are also supported for transactional emails too. Let's now discuss some specifics around building AMP emails in Marketing Cloud. While Salesforce Marketing Cloud supports AMP for email, there are some considerations when creating AMP emails. Firstly, if you're retrieving content at open time or submitting form data from your email, then you'll need to create a publicly accessible endpoint that can be accessed from your email. And Cloud Pages is a very convenient method to do this. Just create a JSON code resource page containing your server-side code. For security reasons, as I mentioned before, any XML HTTP requests or HXR requests to retrieve content or post form data requires CORS HTTP headers to be configured on your Cloud Page. Now, you can obtain the SSJS code to validate and set CORS headers from the code that I'm just about to share with you. Additionally, the AMP mustache component in AMP emails is used to display open time-based content, but the AMP and mustache syntax is identical to guide template language, and therefore you'll need to escape OMM delimiters to force mustache tags not to be interpreted at send time and stripped from your email, which you can do by adding the following delimiter pattern right at the top of your email. Now, while the standard Marketing Cloud Open Tracking Pixel can be included in AMP emails, the same tracking code is used for both HTML and AMP emails. As a result, you won't be able to identify who opened the AMP version of the email versus the HTML fallback version. As a solution, I'd recommend implementing some server-side code to add record to a data extension when the email is opened. You can learn more about this technique in a upcoming video I've got on mc.chat. So head over to mc.chat and you can actually subscribe to my YouTube channel from there, which I'll post next week. Finally, you can include AMP script in AMP emails to personalize content at send time. For example, if you're retrieving from or posting form data to a cloud page, then you can use the cloud pages URL AMP script function in your email, which would return the published URL along with an appended query string with send related data, including the subscriber key, the job ID, list ID, and much more. However, content block AMP script functions, so that is content block by key, content block by name, content block by ID, cannot be used in AMP emails. Well, we've covered a lot of ground today. I've explained what AMP email is and the capabilities of the framework. I've also shared a number of examples that showcase the capabilities of AMP emails. And I've walked you through step-by-step building an AMP email, which dynamically retrieves content at open time and posts form data asynchronously. This feature will be rolling out to Marketing Cloud accounts starting today and will be available on all accounts by March 1. For additional information, check out these 4 resources. Also, I'm currently completing a book titled AMP for Email Developers Guide, which will be available next quarter in both print and online. So stay tuned for that. So we now have plenty of time for questions, and there are some, I think there are some questions coming up in the Q&A panel. So that's great. I'm just going to go and stop sharing and start my video. So you can see me here. And so let's take a look at, gosh, so many questions. And I'm just going to go and there are, I'm not quite sure where to start, maybe from the top here. So can we collectively use all of our Marketing Cloud instances to spam Microsoft with requests to support AMP in Outlook? Yeah, great question. Just a side note on that, AMP for email was supported in Outlook.com for a short period of time. But it was really just a developer preview, and they kind of withdrew that at the end of last year. They're just kind of sitting it out and want to see how AMP emails play out. Microsoft's response is, well, we have our own AMP style framework. Of course they do. But they've really done the hard work, and they've added support. So I'm sure they'll be going and closely monitoring the MIME types used in emails, and kind of once it starts to kind of hit a threshold, then they may enable it. But yeah, it would be great to see in Outlook. Next question is, would the email when reopened always show the thank you page or the feedback form again? What a fantastic example. So a question, thank you very much. I assume you're referring to the Adidas review. So it can show whatever you want. In this example, it's just loading the form again. However, this isn't complete. What will eventually happen is that if they've submitted the form, then I'll have AMP list to go. I use AMP list to go and retrieve kind of the status. And if they've submitted the form for that product, then it will display a different message saying you've already completed this form. Yes, absolutely, you can go and make that completely contextual. So only the HTML version, the shades. So curious to see how the lipstick email looks like with only HTML version. The shades, quantity, buttons are non-clickable or totally not shown. So yes, the HTML fallback version, I don't have it to hand. But it's really not that exciting. It's just a static HTML with a call to action to go and click on a button. It's just there's nothing really worth showing there. But can expressions reference the state of other components? Joseph asks. Components themselves don't really have a state. components can go and set a state. So that is, I can use, for example, in within my AMP list, I can obviously have a button, as I showed you, to go and set a state, which could then be used perhaps via a different component like AMP image to go and change the image based on that state variable that's been set. You see, ask, can a form submit to a data extension? Absolutely. And that's a very common use case. You would just go and add your server-side code to go and insert or upsert. You can either use AMP script or server-side JavaScript. I exclusively use server-side JavaScript because both AMP list and AMP form require a JSON object coming back. And while technically you can go and write this or build it using AMP script, it's just so much more easier to do with server-side JavaScript. So again, I'll have an example of that available on mc.chat next week. Can we read and write form data to data extensions? Yeah, of course you can. So, using AMP list, again, this is just a very simple primitive example, but those that JSON array could be maybe constructed from a row set. And, in fact, you can use that. I think it's I always get confused. It's I think the native platform function just returns that's the lookup rows platform function returns a JSON array of all your form fields and their objects. So you can just simply go and take that and stringify it and pass it back to the email. Good question from Jarrett. How does fallback in general work for AMP? What happens to the form elements and links when you fall back to the HTML version? So yeah, it's actually very simple. If we just go and have a look at this email here and view message source, show original. I mean, I've got a lot of other things to tell you about how this works as well, but we'll notice there are 3 different parts. So this is the, oh, you can't see it, can you? Let me go and share my screen. That's not going to help anyone. So I'm sharing my screen now. This is the text plain part. And then, oh, sorry, no, this is the text plain part. This is up here. This is my, where's my HTML part? HTML part should be, is it down the bottom? It should be the second. I'm not quite sure. Text HTML is down the bottom there. It's an interesting order. I'm not quite sure why it's not set next in the tree. But and then so basically what happens if it can't go and pass the this one, it will just go and display the text, the HTML part here, and then obviously fall back to the text, the plain text version. There are 2 scenarios when that would occur. 3 scenarios. One, if there are issues with loading your AMP code. Secondly, if you were to view it in an unsupported user agent, such as for example, Outlook. And thirdly, and this varies by email service, AMP content can expire. So for Gmail, AMP content expires after 30 days, and we'll just go and display the HTML version. Have I tested form submit to DE Manager? I haven't, and I wouldn't recommend anyone attempts form submit to DE Manager. DE Manager is a really legacy feature and is fraught with security issues where the user password is stored perpetually in the platform, and it's just there's some big issues. Please don't use DE Manager under any for any reasons. If an AMP form does not display, can it fall back to out-of-the-box interactive email form? Jennifer asks. Yes, what a fantastic question. So of course, yes, if you've gone and built, if you're using the interactive email in Marketing Cloud, it will go and if the AMP email can't be displayed, it will fall back to the HTML version, which of course, for template-based emails could include an interactive email, which would then go and fall back to another HTML version if viewed in Outlook. Yeah, this is a great question. How is the connection to the commerce made from within the email? And it's not as straightforward as you'd think. So I assumed kind of incorrectly that I could, or was hoping at least, I could actually use property binding. That is to go and construct my href attribute or my href attribute value using a state variable, which is kind of straightforward to do, and then go and have that href in square brackets to bind that to a link, but that's not supported. So I really need to create a video about this, but what you need to do is to actually go and submit a form to a server. And in fact, let me go and show you an example of this. If we go back to here, for example, this one here, this button down the bottom, I've actually got two buttons. So I've got this one here, which is perpetually disabled. It makes you kind of think there's a button there, but it's always disabled. And then what you have to do is you have to go and you can only go and bind using again, you can't use property binding to href attributes. So you're going to have to go and make a post request to go and saying, these are my numbers. And then you get in that response payload, we get I'm using AmpMoustache to go and get that URL from my response payload. And I can then use AmpMoustache to display this here. So I'm using, this is displayed when the form is submitted successfully. And then I'm also using what are called CSS hooks to go and hide the disable button kind of completely, which so that will only appear. So now it's showing. So yeah, that's how you do it, but kind of very tricky. Other questions? We've got time for a few more, I think. Yeah, if I'm using an iPhone, does the native Apple email app support AMP emails, or would you need to download specific supported apps such as Gmail or Yahoo Mail apps? And the answer is no. Apple Mail on iOS does not support AMP email. They have to use the Gmail or Yahoo apps. Also, another thing, dark mode is not supported. If you attempt to go and view an email in dark mode, it will just fall back to the HTML version. Any other questions? You've got a few minutes, so there's some wonderful questions. Maybe I can also share some other tips, and then I'll answer Daniel's question in a second. Other things you need to know. Yeah, firstly, this is a very important one, is before you can actually go and start sending emails, you need to go and register your from email address to go and send emails, send AMP emails. And you can do this in one place. You head over to amp.dev. You head over to amp.dev. I'm not going to find it now. It's kind of buried in there somewhere. And it takes you to a Google form that you can submit. This is my domain that I'm sending from, and it has to be an SAP domain or private domain. So this is the email address, and you have to go and then send Google a sample email so they can go and check the content. You only have to do that once, and you only have to submit one form. So that's Google will then go and share that result with Yahoo and Mail.ru, which is very kind of them. Also, there are at this time at least, no additional super message charges for AMP emails. Now, obviously, there is for interactive email, but none for AMP emails. Does AMP code execute in Content Builder? Well, yeah, yes and no. So as we saw, we can preview AMP emails, but all it's actually doing is interpreting any AMP script or or even guide template language, I guess, in my email, and that that preview that we saw just uses the native browser capabilities that's available, in this case in Chrome, to preview and interact with our email. Can you include email attachments with AMP? No. No, you can't. In fact, I've never tried it. I don't think you can, but because it's attached separately. I don't know is the answer. I just I'm not sure. I have to go and test that. I've no knowledge of programming languages. In your opinion, what would be the main steps to learn AMP and JavaScript to build interactive emails? And look, this is a really great question. And look, you really need to acknowledge that AMP emails is kind of the next generation of emails. And, as such, you need to go and learn the next generation of language. If you don't know JavaScript, then you're not going to be able to get very far. I mean, I break this down as crawl, walk, run. You can move from crawl to walk, pretty quickly. I showed a really sophisticated AMP email, but if all you want to do is like a simple accordion action using AMP accordion or AMP sidebar, then or maybe want to display an image carousel, you don't need to know any JavaScript. But when you want to start loading lists dynamically and building expressions, you really need to have an understanding of JavaScript. Not because you write JavaScript, but you need to understand kind of the concepts of ternary operators and objects and properties and methods. A good starting point is that there are tons. The good news is there are tons of JavaScript resources available. Pluralsight.com has some incredible courses, and there are also many free courses as well. W3 Schools, actually, that's how I learned JavaScript. It's a very good self-guided tutorial. How do you authenticate that the person submitting the form is actually the recipient of the user? So yeah, you can't really. I mean, CORS goes and validates that the request is coming from. It goes and passes across the from name in the email. You can obviously go and inject attributes like a subscriber key, either by using maybe a hidden field and personalization strings of _ subscriber key, or of course Cloud Pages URL, which will go and probably more sensible to add those as an encrypted query string. But you can't go and validate that this person is actually who they say they are. If they do forward the email, then the AMP part is stripped from the email, so it's kind of safe. But if their email inbox is compromised and someone actually opens that email, there's no way to validate it. If you are kind of looking for security, if you want to, for example, check out directly from that email, or maybe you want to kind of have a two-step verification, technically, and this is one of the things I'm going to do next, is actually you could have a button to go and which you click on, and it will send you an SMS from Mobile Connect with a authentication code, which you can type in your email and click submit and return a response to verify that that person is who they say they are. I mean, that's kind of cool, right? So if you know their mobile number. Could you require PIN to open an email? So question from Matthew, like I said, yes. And if you were to do that, I would, yeah, great question. I would use that two-factor flow where you go and send them a PIN or a code to a mobile number, and they enter that within the email. Is the AMP framework supported in Cloud Pages too? No. No, because it goes and sets a different MIME type. So I can't build AMP websites in Cloud Pages. At least I don't think you can. How does AMP email work in the forwarded inbox? I just explained that. It's not supported. Last question. Do you think AMP will be the future of email standardization? Let's hope so. And so thank you, everyone. We've run out of time and I've got to walk into another meeting now. I hope you've found this session valuable. I'll be posting a link for you to go and download a recording of the session along with my slides in the next few hours. So thanks and enjoy the rest of your day or evening.